The pastors here. I'm privileged to introduce our brother, Dr. Andy McIntosh, who's traveled all the way from the UK to be with us this afternoon, and we're excited to hear him talk about science and creation and just give us the Word of God as well. I also wanted to just give a few quick announcements. He does have a book table in the back there that you could purchase different creation science books and DVDs, but there is a sign-up sheet on there. If you're interested, sign up on there and you can get his prayer letter through email. He's really keen on people doing that so they can be informed about the ministry that he does all around the world. With that, I'm going to, also there's going to be 3 sessions, and we'll have a break in between each sessions. There's going to be snacks and coffee out on the patio out here, so you could fellowship and get to talk to people and enjoy some snacks in between. But let's start off with a word of prayer. Father, we do thank you that you brought us here today. We pray that you'd speak to us and use our brother and bless your name for what you've done in creation and all the wonderful design we see all around us every day. We pray you'd encourage us and bless us, we ask in Jesus' name. Amen.
Well, it's really good to be with you. Thank you to the pastors here for running this weekend. And I'm so grateful for the fellowship. I've been here before. It was actually 2015 that I came. It doesn't seem but like yesterday, but there we go. That's what it is. And it's lovely to hear a lovely Scottish accent from Robert, Pastor Robert. And but also I've got some friends here who've come. They're actually in my church at Milnrose, so it's a home from home. So please go and say hello to them afterwards, Les and Sally Roberts. It's nice to have you with us. So it's really good to be here. And of course, the English that I'm speaking is the proper English, of course. You're the guys with the accents. But that's just clearing up a few things here. But can I just mention something else before I really do get going? And that's this. By the way, I think I need to make these Troy or one of the guys who operates it, can you just make the image a little bit smaller? Because we're actually losing part of the sides. You'll have to do it at the front or that's right. That's just about it. Yeah, thank you. So I just asked Pastor Christian whether I could just mention this. It's a summer school that we've started running, Truth in Science. And it's now in its 5th go at sort of building this work up. We're trying to reach young people in my country who are horribly affected by theistic evolution. We're affected by woke ideology, which is coming into our young people. And we are very burdened for them. So we want to prepare them for the onslaught that's going to hit them when they go to college. And so we aim at getting, as you can see there, this was last year's group. We got 120 people there, 100 students and about 20 staff. And we're all volunteering, and we're not charging the full what it costs. So it's actually a work which we're really looking to the Lord to get this motoring. And we started it in 2019. We had to stop in 2020 and go online. Then we got up to about 80 in 2021. We had 100 last year, 2022. So this is strictly the 5th one, but the 4th face-to-face. We've got all sorts of people speaking on the creation issues, but also speaking on the humanities, speaking against the woke ideology, which is really sweeping across our nation. And sadly, it's come here a lot as well. So perhaps you could pray for it. And if you feel led of the Lord to give to the work, as I say, we're subsidizing these students. Perhaps you could just go to the website. It's truthinscience.uk. That's all you have to remember. All written together, truthinscience.uk. And there is opportunity there to donate if you wish to. So that's what I'm really burdened for. Before I leave this world, I almost left it in 2021. I want to see established a new work amongst students. I'm really burdened to reach the next generation who's going to lead my little country and maybe influence other countries. for the sake of the gospel, which I really love, and I want to see people really reached in very troubled days in which we live. Anyway, less of that. I want to speak now on has science killed God? And I'm not going to assume that you're Christians when I now do this first talk, right? So the other talks, I'm not necessarily commenting on whether or not you're a Christian. I'm just simply speaking to you about the evidence of the science, which we will look at. The next talk will be on the stars, and then the third talk will be on the wonder of human hearing. But this talk is aiming directly at those who think that atheism is the only answer, okay? In fact, I wrote a booklet called Are You Really an Atheist? There's a lot of these, which I want you to just take. They're 2 for $1, because I'm aiming that other people who want to give them out just take a wad of these and sort it out with Joey, who's running the bookstall. There's another one which I've written, Is It True? Evidence for Creation. This is a summary of the big book. I've given the last copy to Pastor Robert, and he can show it to you what it is. You'll have to order some more from to get them here. A number of the pastors have got copies, and they all went on Wednesday, all the rest. So I'm sorry, we've already sold out of one of the books. But this is a summary of that book, and it's only a couple of dollars for that. There's quite a lot of copies of that. And if you want to buy the big book, which is no longer got any more copies for, it's advertised at the back. There's DVDs there. One of them's A Skeptical Look at Atheism. That's $5. There's one here on the bombardier beetle, which I'll mention today. Creation, so what's the issue? That's for Christians to see that it's biblically important. The Wonder of Hearing, that's the third talk I'm going to do today. My other 2 books, Genesis for Today, that is $10, I think we made it. And my other book, Genesis 1 to 11, is $7. So there's lots of material there. So help yourself, and do look at the look at the list if you'd like to add your name, as Pastor Christian said earlier, if you'd like to pray for the work. I'm therefore addressing now in this talk a person who says, look, Andy, atheism is the answer. Yeah, there's no God. I know that the science has completely removed that idea. Maybe you've followed Dawkins and you've followed other well-known atheists over here, and you've come to the conclusion that there is no God. Well, let me tell you that there is a very robust case. Not just a case, but frankly, you just cannot remove these arguments for actually showing that the Christian position is the most clear case for understanding the evidence. I'm going to look at science, then I'm going to look at rationality, then I'm going to look at ethics and meaning. And sorry, Troy, I'm going to have to come down and deal with this. Is that right? Yeah, it doesn't look right. It's okay. I'll leave it. It's going to take too long to try and sort that out. But the picture looks a bit squashed. Doesn't matter, as long as you can read it. And I want to now also, under the science, deal with these 4 sub-issues. But this is where I'm going in the overall talk. I'm going to spend most of my time talking about the science. Then I'm going to talk about how do you think, right? So I'm going to stretch your brains in this first talk, because that is a very interesting point. Then I'll talk a bit about morality and meaning. So in talking about the science, these are 4 points to do with the science. We need to define what is science. We need to define what we mean by who is God. And then I'll talk about famous scientists and some examples of the science. So in defining what is science, I'm going to say that science has to be testable. In other words, you're not just dealing with the imaginations of somebody. You're actually dealing with the reality of something concrete which you can measure in the laboratory. And you expect that when you measure it, you can actually possibly make some deductions. We have the word hypothesis, where you suggest an explanation, you suggest what's going on, and you do other experiments to prove that, and either prove your hypothesis or disprove it. That is the way that science works. And that sort of thing can only happen in the physical world. It cannot happen in something which is outside something which can be measured by definition. So that means that science is actually limited, and a true scientist knows that he cannot say that there is everything in what he's doing, that he can't cover all the bases because he cannot go everywhere in the universe, and he has to be open to the possibility that there might be a reality. He cannot just dismiss this point. He has to be open to the possibility that there could be a reality which is not physical. And I'll come back to that point, because it's not just the area of the spiritual, it's the area which you'll see, which is to do with right on the boundaries of the physical. I'll come to that a bit later. Have you come across people who say science has all the answers? I'm sure you have when you've been on the maybe on the campus here of University of California, Riverside, UCR, and you've come across people who say, no, science has all the answers. Is that true or is it false? And the answer is that it's false, because science deals with the what, as I've just been indicating. It deals with the how, but it cannot, by its very nature, deal with the why. Why am I here? It cannot say that. It has no answer to it. It's not something you can measure. It's all to do with meaning, so it cannot deal with purpose or meaning. So science clearly has to be limited. Now, a true scientist knows that. When Dawkins and Lawrence Krauss and others strut across their stages speaking to packed audiences, saying that science has all the answers, they're not really being true to the discipline. The great scientists that I'm going to show you shortly knew this point. They knew that there was a limitation to what actually science could do. And so they had a humility about them, even those who weren't necessarily Christians in the past. People like Einstein, even though he wasn't a believer in the Christian God, he nevertheless had a sense of humility about what he could and could not do with his science. And there's one other thing I need to say about the science, is that if I do an experiment on Tuesday and I come back to the same laboratory, same conditions, and I do the experiment on Wednesday, that I expect there to be the same result. In other words, there should be repeatability. It's a big issue, that, actually. If you don't get repeatability, a true scientist will say, there's something wrong here. I cannot write on this. I cannot publish this until I've sorted out why is my experiment not the same as maybe what somebody else did in another laboratory, same conditions, or else what I did the other day. And until you sort that out, a true good scientist will not be publishing until he's sorted that matter out. And of course, Origins is not open to repeatable experiments. You can't go back and say, right, let's make another universe over here. Okay, people are suggesting multiverse ideas, which is basically just in their imaginations. But frankly, you can't do repeatable experiments when you're dealing with Origins. Let me just briefly talk about some famous scientists. Brian Cox and Richard Dawkins and other people, Jerry Coyne, a famous scientist from the University of Chicago, who wrote the book Evolution is a Fact. They will say things like, scientists don't believe in God. We'll soon, there's a famous interview of Jerry Coyne with actually a British interviewer, and he just sits there saying, well, I find it very interesting when I have Christians in my class, and I tell them that evolution is not consistent with their worldview. And of course, he's right. If evolution is true, which of course he believes it's true, then it just is not consistent. And so if you're dealing with a secular evolutionary outlook, in a sense, that statement could be right from that person's point of view. But the point is that isn't the only way to do the science. So actually that statement is false, and I'll show you why it's false. Because others in the past had a very different worldview when it came to looking at the science. Clearly, Isaac Newton, you need to be careful with Isaac Newton. He was not a Bible-believing Christian in the sense that we would use that today. He was more of a deist. He didn't believe that Christ was God. But nevertheless, he did believe in God. Robert Boyle clearly was a Christian, and I'm jumping a bit here because that's the very early 1700s, late 1600s. If I come to Michael Faraday, some of us were around Pastor Troy's house last night, and we were talking about him. Well, he lived in the late 1700s, he was born, and then early part of the 1800s. He's probably the greatest experimentalist, both chemist and physicist, ever. Because it was absolutely momentous, the sort of discoveries that Michael Faraday made. He discovered that electricity and magnetism are connected. And he showed it, and it was a sort of an intuitive understanding. He never went to a university, and yet, he basically solved some of the biggest riddles in chemistry and physics in his day. Johann Kepler on the continent in Germany, or what is now Germany, he understood the motions of the planets, and he set up the laws which he reckoned that the planets were following, such that the area which is swept by the elliptical orbit of any satellite, whether it be a moon or whether it be an artificial satellite, the area swept through at a given one particular time will always be the same. And that's a very important law, and NASA is using it all the time when they send up their next Mars rovers and whatnot to all the planets. James Clerk Maxwell, a brilliant Scottish scientist who at 49 did far more than most of us would ever do in 10 lives. He was just an incredible mind. But both Johann Kepler, Michael Faraday, and James Clerk Maxwell were clearly believers in God. That's the issue. James Clerk Maxwell took the two equations of electricity, the two equations of magnetism, put them together, realized there was a wave equation, and with brilliant mathematical understanding, predicted the wave speed of electromagnetic radiation, in other words, the speed of light. And along came Foucault a bit later on, and Millikan and others. They measured it, and it was clearly just what Maxwell had said. That is brilliant what he did. He said, when you measure it, it will be 300,000 meters per second. Give or take a few meters per second, that's exactly what it is. Lord Kelvin is the basis, he laid the basis of my subject, thermodynamics. Louis Pasteur, these were people who clearly believed in God. Louis Pasteur basically said, you'll only get life from life. You will never get life from non-life. So people today try to say that they can get life, abiogenesis, without a mind. Frankly, Louis Pasteur would say, you're on the wrong track, mate. He'd say it in French, of course. And today, you won't know these people. Steve Taylor, who's a colleague of mine in University of Liverpool, brilliant electronics and electrical engineer. Stuart Burgess, who is the co-author of this little book and the big book, which that is a summary of. He's absolutely brilliant. He was the one who constantly, your cycling team, want to raid his home to work out how on earth he has reduced the friction on the Olympic bikes, and it's a trade secret which only he knows the answer to. And constantly our British UK cycling team always wins the Olympics to the chagrin of the team from the USA. But that's due to Stuart Burgess. He's absolutely brilliant. A very humble guy. If ever you get the chance to hear him, go and hear him. He's a wonderful colleague, and I've got a huge respect for him. His mind is utterly up there. David Galloway from Robert's country. He's a beautiful Scottish lilt to him as well, and he's retired now, but he was the president of the Glasgow College of Surgeons. And these are people who clearly believed in God. So when Brian Cox and other people say scientists don't believe in God, even by today's knowledge, that's wrong. Michael Faraday said this in one lecture. This is just to show you the greatness of Michael Faraday. He was there with the Prince Consort, Prince Albert, sometimes Queen Victoria and others, nobility, in the middle of London, giving lectures often to young people, children, particularly at Christmas. He would give special lectures for them. But he said on one occasion, and this is in my grandfather's book about Michael Faraday. My grandfather sadly didn't believe in the gospel, but he loved Michael Faraday's memory, and he wrote a book about it. So I've got that at home, and I have this sort of strange connection, as it were, with that period through him. And this is Michael Faraday speaking. Therefore, our philosophy, like we would use the word our science, whilst it shows us these things, should lead us to think of him, God, who has not, we would say, made them. For it is said by an authority far above even that which these works present, the Bible, Romans 1:20, that the invisible things of him, God, from the creation of the world, are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead. This was the attitude of people in the past, right? People, great scientists. So when Dawkins comes along and says, oh, you can't believe in God, it's just a crutch, he is ignoring the history of science. James Clerk Maxwell had written on the Cavendish laboratories, and it's still there today in Latin. I wish he'd done it in English, but he chose to do it in Latin. He had written over the door of the Cavendish laboratories, I showed you this on Wednesday, the works of the Lord are great, sought out of all them that have pleasure therein. Psalm 111, verse 2. It's absolutely clear that the history of science is linked with the rise of the Christian faith. Now, as we come to consider the science, we need to define, well, who is God? Who are we thinking of? Well, we're saying, if he exists, because obviously I'm speaking to a person who may not yet be convinced. So most of us here are Christians. But if there's some people here who are still thinking, and that's why I'm trying to speak to you, still thinking that there isn't evidence of God, well, we need to define our terms. If he is a God, he is in a realm which is essentially not physical, and we would call that he is transcendent. That is, he's not defined by the physical world, he's outside of it, but can relate to it. You understand my meaning? And secondly, he is all-powerful and is able to interact with the physical world. Now, with that in mind, let's now look at some examples of science. And the example I'm going to take first of all is my own science. I've worked quite a lot on the bombardier beetle, and I'm still doing some work on it, actually, with a view to actually developing a fire sprinkler system based on the spray of this bombardier beetle. Let me show you what it does.
Few creatures will risk annoying a bombardier
Can you
beetle.
turn it up, yeah?
It mixes a cocktail of deadly chemicals in a special chamber. They react and explode at boiling point from its rear end in an awesome chemical weapon.
Pretty clever little beetle, isn't it? And it sprays through a combustion chamber, which is actually takes a lot of work to understand, because this was done by a scientist who's now died at Cornell University. But he actually took these electron micrographs, these photos. This is only about 1 millimeter long, so you're looking at something absolutely tiny. And when he showed me this, I realized in discussions with him that we've got an exhaust valve here, that which lifts up a bit of cuticle here and a membrane sitting on it, which lifts up under pressure. You can't see it here, but there is actually a set of inlet valves there. Now, I'm not going to go into all the detail of this, but by copying that system, I, with others, of course, in the University of Leeds, developed a spray system which is using that spray using that principle of inlet valves, which are closing under pressure, and exhaust valves, thanks Troy, exhaust valves which are opening under pressure. So we then built this. So this is our spray system, which can go quite fast, as you can see there. It's bigger than the Beetle, obviously. It's about 20 times as big. But it's already been patented, and the spray has now been used to add additives into diesel engines to stop them pushing out nasty chemicals and soot and everything else. And that's being done in Sweden. So some of these applications have already been used. We were thinking of actually developing, as I said, a fire sprinkler system based on the Bombardier Beetle. Here's the early rig that we developed. This was the very first rig that we developed. And this is just water being squirted into a very sophisticated receptacle. It's actually a bin, which is being squirted into. But that was our very first copy of the Bombardier Beetle system. So all this, it suggests strongly that there is a design system in the Bombardier Beetle, because you're not going to play around with chemicals and get away with it if you're just going to just be random in what you're doing with chemicals. You're in danger of blowing yourself up if you don't get it right. You've got you've got a lot of heat from the chemicals. It's hydrogen peroxide and hydroquinone. Those chemicals are pretty nasty if you have them. If you don't control them, you've got to have a combustion chamber. You've got to have a number of things right in order to get that system working. So to suggest that that Beetle has evolved it, frankly, doesn't fit the facts. Some people have tried to say the primitive ones never had that system and they just oozed out hydroquinones. Insects do that all the time. And it's well known that they operate by a lot of smells, so that's why people have said that. But actually the evidence shows that it's really the reverse. There are some Bombardier Beetles which have probably lost through mutations the ability to heat up the fluid. And you've still got some variations then in Bombardier Beetles. The technical term for them is Brachyna. And these Brachynae carabidae, which means ground-hugging beetles, basically. And these creatures, all the indications are that those which have the ability to push out a hot spray are the ones which are not mutants, and that the ones which don't heat up so easily are the ones which have got mutation in them. But anyway, from this came a lot of very interesting applications, some of which I've already referred to. The one I haven't yet referred to is a pharmaceutical application and aerosols as well. Fire extinguishers, fire sprinklers is the thing that I'm working on at the moment. So if it's taken all these minds to actually get this system working for the application in engineering, doesn't that indicate that the Beetle itself actually has got some pretty clever, sophisticated systems which required a mind to make them? I think it does very much say that. It certainly got a prize when we finally got all this together and became known by the outside world. A few years ago, the Times Higher Educational Establishment gave a surprise to the University of Leeds and to Swedish Biomimetics 3000, which sponsored the work. That's one example. Let me give you another example which shows to us that there is evidence of design in yet another area. Let me just take a very simple leaf. There's literally trillions of leaves all over the world. Very easy just to sort of think, oh, it's just a leaf. But what's going on in a leaf is utterly amazing, even from a thermodynamic point of view. There's energy coming in from the sun. Now, this is showing you a deciduous leaves. You don't have so many of these. You have some, but not so many in California because the weather pattern is so different here. But where I am, you get, in the winter, all these deciduous leaves just fall off the trees. And then come spring, late spring, you get these wonderful new leaves coming, which is what that picture is showing, of course. And the energy from the sun hits that leaf, and you don't think anything of it, but it's an amazing system that's going on there. In the leaf, of course, energy is coming in from the sun, but how does it convert it into whoops, just suddenly lost it. What happened there? Oh, it's come back. Energy comes in from the sun, and it makes sugar. We all love sugar. Well, plants want sugar. They need energy in order to grow. They need sugars, sucrose and other types of sugars that they need. But what goes on, you can't quite see it here. I'm sorry, it's not come out in the screen too well. But this is the radiant energy of the sun, right? Carbon dioxide is in the air. The carbon dioxide and the water is then combined to produce sugar and oxygen. So you actually get a resulting oxygen, which is a byproduct of this, which of course is a great help to us, and all the mammals which breathe in oxygen, but the plants are breathing in carbon dioxide. By the way, people say that we're causing the growth in carbon dioxide. I don't think that's true at all, but that's another subject. I think we need to rethink all those things about climate. But there is a lovely balance between nature, the plants which take in the carbon dioxide, and we take in oxygen. Now, the plants are taking in carbon dioxide and combining it with water, but in order to do all this, they need something there, and it's called chlorophyll. And it's the chlorophyll which gives the green look of the leaves, because the leaves absorb energy, but not the green. They reflect the green. But they absorb the infrared, they absorb a lot of the other frequencies in the light that's coming in. Now, without the chlorophyll, which is like a catalyst, nothing would happen. The chlorophyll is a vital catalyst on the surface chemistry of the leaf. And the whole process of this whole thing is called photosynthesis. The chemicals steps involved in photosynthesis are not just one step, it's actually a whole set of steps, which I'm not going to go into all the details of. But frankly, it comes under the word, I don't mean nuts and bolts here, it comes under the idea of chemical machinery. You need a whole set of chemicals which are all involved in the photosynthesis, which is sparked off by this catalyst of chlorophyll, which then causes energy to be used to go down special chemical pathways to produce sugar and oxygen. Random energy never builds working biological machines. If you're still not convinced, let me give you one last example from the science. In other words, I'm telling you that the science is like a massive signpost saying there is a mind behind this system. I love engines, old locomotives, right? I love aircraft as well, old aircraft. And we still got some very old locomotives. This is the Royal Scot, and this is an example of the Royal Scot going through Shrewsbury when I was coming back from a meeting. And I happened to be, you wouldn't see it very well because it was at night, but it reminded me of my youth when I used to see these locomotives going through where I used to live in North Wales, and you could almost time British Rail by the clock. You know, you didn't need to look at your clock. You knew that that train went through, it was 9 o'clock. And I remember that. That's not true of the railways now, but it was true then. And that's a picture of these locomotives. Now, why am I showing you that? Because did you know that right down at the molecular scale, there is a molecule which does something extraordinary and is a bit like that locomotive going on railways? Just to make you smile, have some of you seen this film, Wallace and Gromit and the Wrong Trousers? Let me just show you a little bit of it. It'll make the kids laugh, if nobody else. I'm a kid at heart, and I love watching this. This is Nick Park at his best. This is what I'm really getting at. This is the kinesin walking molecule. And I think this is just the most superb example of cellular machinery which defies any notion that this could have come about by random mutations. Because you're going to see that this is a cargo molecule which is walking along, the technical term is microtubules, which are like the railway. Granted, it's not making its own microtubules. Other proteins make those microtubules. That's the only difference to Wallace and Gromit. But it's actually happening quite fast in every single cell of your body. If you didn't have kinesin, you'd be dead in a moment. Because this is a cargo molecule which is literally walking along the microtubule.
Meet the kinesin. Masterpieces of microengineering, kinesins are miniature motorized machines that carry cargo from one part of the cell to another, walking along self-assembling highways called microtubules. Known as the workhorses of the cell, kinesins have 2 feet, or globular heads, that literally walk 1 foot over another along the microtubule, pulling their cargo to its destination. Each foot possesses 2 special locations called binding sites that interact with other molecules. One site attaches to the microtubule and the other binds with ATP, the energy molecule of the cell. When one foot binds with ATP and uses its energy, the foot flips over, resulting in the walking motion.
So clearly, to have a walking molecule which is with a purpose carrying cargo from one part of the cell to another part, this is all happening right down at the almost the molecular scale. To suggest that didn't come about with purpose and the mind behind it is frankly nonsense. The science is telling you. If you're an engineer, which I've been trained in, and a lot of the biologists are sort of suppressing their innate brains which tell them there is a mind there, they say, oh, no, we're not even going to consider that option. But actually, when you do engineering, you've got to consider design, because that's the way engineering progresses. And an engineering mind immediately sees a mind behind this. And of course, it's all linked with the software, which I won't go into now, the software which is all to do with the triplets of nucleotides, which codes for amino acids, which make the proteins, which I referred to there. It also, the DNA software system makes the ATP, which was mentioned in that video, which is the adenosine triphosphate molecule. That itself is made by ATP synthase, which is an incredible system for, it's actually a motor which makes ATP. So there is a whole host of subsystems here which is telling you that everything is governed by an information system. Now, I told you that I was going to get to the edges of the science. And on the edges of the physical world, we don't just have things to do with spirit, which of course you thought that I was thinking of, which, yes, I'm going to come to that. But even within the science, on the edges of the science, you come to things to do with not matter, not energy, and yet control. Control systems, which we're familiar with in California. This is the state where all the computing revolution took place. This is where Steve Jobs did his work to make probably slightly better computers than the opposition. At least that's my view. But maybe you think PCs have it, but whatever. Bill Gates, who is of the other opposition crowd, He admitted that DNA is like a computer program, but far, far more advanced than any software ever created by man, he means. Well, what's that telling you? There must be a mind behind the DNA software. Well, I'm going to leave the science, but what I'm saying is that the science, which I've spent most of the time on in this talk deliberately, is telling you, like signposts, that there is something more. Now, let me come on to the next thing that I want to just briefly refer to, these other 3 points. It's majoring on the science, but now I'm going to cover these next 3 points fairly quickly. This one, though, we just need to just step back a moment. What am I saying when I talk about logic and rationality? What is rationality? What is the ability to think? What is logic itself? If I leave mud long enough, like 13.7 billion years, will it produce mathematics? The answer is no. You'd be foolish to say otherwise. If I leave a rock on its own, does it produce logical thought? No. So how do you define logic? How do you define mental processes that you're using in your laboratory? Maybe you're a scientist here and you're used to working with scientific knowledge, as I've been doing in my career. Here is a well-known atheist in his day, Haldane, JBS Haldane, and he said, if my mental processes are determined solely by the motions of atoms in my brain, I have no reason to suppose that my beliefs are true, and hence I have no reason for supposing that my brain is composed of atoms. Do you get the point of what he's saying? How do I know anything he's saying? How can I actually assess logically what is correct? I'm not talking about correct morally at the moment. I'm just talking about doing mathematics. How do I know that 2 and 2 is equal to 4? Because obviously I'm making assumptions to do with bases, the base 10 and all the rest of it. But how do I know that that's true? How do I actually know anything? How can I assess any reality outside of my own physical body? Haldane is actually making a very important point. In fact, this whole area of thought and rationality is what brought the famous C.S. Lewis from rank atheism when he came back from the First World War, when he'd seen people die in the trenches, very much like in Ukraine today, that sort of situation. He came back from that. He said, there can't be a God. Look at all this awful stuff that's going on. There is no God. And then he got into conversation with people, other students who were speaking to him in Cambridge. And he realized that he couldn't explain his own rationality. He was not a physicist or a mathematician, but he was a brilliant philosopher. And he says this: nature is quite powerless to produce rational thought. Not that she never modifies our thinking, but that the moment she does so, it ceases for that very reason to be rational. For, as we've seen, a train of thought loses all rational credentials as soon as it can be shown to be wholly the result of non-rational causes. Look, Pastor Christian is over there, right? And if Pastor Christian was looking at me and saying, Andy, you're speaking nonsense, right? And supposing I start getting up and I say a load of trash, basically, and Pastor Christian says, there's something wrong with you, Andy. I'm going to take you to the hospital, right? And they find out that I've got a drug, I've eaten something. And, they track it down to, yeah, you ate this drug and that's made you speak nonsense. In other words, you tracked it down to something physical. That's what basically he's saying here. A train of thought loses all rational credentials as soon as it could be shown to be wholly the result of non-rational causes. In other words, it's the chemistry and the physics which is causing it. You're no longer doing independent thought. You're just the product of chemistry. Well, if that was the case, then rational thought's gone out of the window. And he knew that. So where does rationality come from? Rationality is the mark of mind. And mind, of course, is given to us by who? I'm going to say, quite unashamedly, like Genesis 1 verse 27 says, we are made in the image of God. That is the mark of humanity. Francis Schaeffer rightly said that if you lose God in your thinking, you lose the definition of humanity as well. And he was pretty prophetic in some of the statements he made 40 years ago, when he said, we'll lose all definition of what it is to begin humanity, so abortion will be on the increase, and euthanasia will be next, and of course that's exactly what's happening. If we lose God in our thinking, we lose the definition of what it is to be human. So logic and rationality is the mark of mind. I need to just bring you to this point, because Richard Dawkins made this statement that the universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. He was faced with a conversation once in Oxford High Street with my friend John Hawley, who's been, we seem to have lost it. Troy, can you just move we've lost the picture. You're losing the right-hand side. I'm not quite sure why we're losing it. In fact, it could be the settings.
I think that's what it is. It's from there.
Ah, dear, no, it's this, that's...
I tried adjusting it here, and this is about as
Let me,
keystones on.
it is odd that we've got that. You're right. It is, you're quite right. We haven't got this set up correctly. See whether I can get the display back. I think we're going to find this difficult to do. I had it right earlier. Display settings, scaled. Oh dear. I hadn't realized that that had happened. I can't. I think it may be on there, actually. Can you press one of the buttons to go through the various options? It's not playing properly. Settings.
Is this an example of blind, holiness, indifference?
Yeah, it could be, yeah. I don't know why it's doing this. No, it's something. That's very odd, because it's losing the, I think we're going to have to. Now it's come right, but now we've lost the color for some reason. It's because it's on this HDMI cable. I'm going to have to go back to the other cable. If we've got a long enough one. It's something to do with this HDMI that I'm not getting right. Anyway, you've got the words there. That's the important bit. So I'm sorry, we've lost the color for some reason. So anyway, he was in conversation with my friend who's just bending over there. That is John Hawley, whom I know well. And John Hawley said, because he just happened to meet him in Oxford High Street at an open air meeting. And there's Professor Dawkins with the helmet on there, with his bicycle. And John Hawley is a very courteous English gentleman, he really is. He said, Professor Dawkins, where does your mind come from? And he said, I'm not made in the image of God, if that's what you think. And he said, but where does your ability to think come from? And he got rather angry. And he said at the end of the conversation, my brain is just a lump of meat. Well, let me ask the question. If his brain is just a lump of meat, why should we believe anything that Richard Dawkins says? And that is the very point that I'm making about rationality. Where does rationality come from? Sorry about the slides not working with this cable for some reason. Let me just summarize this point because I want to move on to the last two. Lee Strobel has said in his book, The Case for God, and it's a very good point. I don't agree with everything that Lee Strobel says, but on this point, he's absolutely right. Against atheism. To continue in atheism, I would need to believe that nothing produces everything, non-life produces life, right? Which is what Louis Pasteur said is wrong. Randomness produces fine-tuning, talking about the universe, and the planets being in exactly the right place. Chaos produces information, which I've touched on already in my science that I mentioned earlier. Unconsciousness produces consciousness. Non-reason produces reason. That's the point I've just been making. Mathematics does not arise out of dead matter. I simply don't have that much faith. That's a very good set of points there, and it really makes you think. Let me now just come on to morality. Don't know why we've got this horrible colour, but anyway, something's gone wrong in the settings. I can't get that right. Morality. Where does morality come from? Now, this is important that as I address this point with an atheist, I am not saying, please get this clear in your mind, and none of us should say, that we are pointing the finger at them saying, we are righteous and they are not. Actually, it's often the reverse. I know some very clean living people who would have no truck with the Christian faith. My point is this: where do they get their ethics from? And the point is, they have no platform for their ethics. This is somebody from New York whom I'd love to meet in Starbucks and have a conversation with. He's written some amazing books. He's written the book Mind and Cosmos. He's written other books like this one, The Last Word. His name is Thomas Nagel. And I'm not going to say that he's totally honest, because I think in the end atheism cannot be true to oneself. But you can see in his own writings is that he's battling with this idea that atheism doesn't really satisfy him. I want atheism to be true, and I'm made uneasy, he says, by the fact that some of the most intelligent and well-informed people I know are religious believers. So he's acknowledging often Christians being in the philosophy departments. It isn't just that I don't believe in God and naturally hope that I'm right in my belief. It's that I hope there is no God. I don't want there to be a God. I don't want the universe to be like that. In other words, he admits that there is a case for morality coming from an absolute outside of himself, but he's fighting it. He's far more honest in that sense than Dawkins is. How come we're living in years and times now where in Britain we are aborting people, and the number of abortions in England, the second block here, is approximately comparable to the deaths due to heart disease and cancer. And sadly, in your country here, you've aborted the whole of the population of the UK since 1973, Roe versus Wade. I know you've recently overturned that, but what an indictment against our two nations. I'm suggesting to you that morality has to flow from an absolute outside of ourselves, because otherwise we're going to get into a terrible position. So Dawkins, when he was faced with the issue of Down syndrome on one of the interviews he gave, he said, I think it's wise and sensible to abort a baby with Down syndrome. Is that right? How on earth do you decide what's right and wrong when you've got no reference point? Melanie Phillips, who is a very interesting commentator in our society, Alistair Begg once gave an interview with Melanie Phillips. If you put it into Google, you'll find it. A very interesting interview. Alistair Begg, lovely, another great Scotsman. He interviews her, and he knows full well that she's not a Christian. She's a Jewish persuasion. But nevertheless, she makes some brilliant comments on the way society is going. And she says in this, not in that particular interview, but in this writing that she's got here, she says, the reason for the existential collapse, she's talking about the relativist West, is because you've brought heavily into the belief that reality is merely what you decide it to be. And then she says a bit later on, essentially what you're saying is, down here, what is right for me is what is right. What I declare something to be is what it is. I feel, therefore I am. In other words, she is basically saying that everything is down to feelings. If you suggest that I'm wrong, I'm going to take you to court, because that's hate speech. That's coming in today, big time. And we've lost all sense of identity because we've said the real I is not defined by God, it's defined by me, which basically is a circular reasoning. So friends, the idea of who am I is big time a problem today. And that's really at the bottom of the transgender movement. It's all to do with, I'm defined by the way I feel, therefore I am. Let me now come to the last point of all, which is, where is meaning? In The New Scientist, that magazine which most scientists take in the laboratory, it had a very interesting cartoon back in 2017. If my work, it says, helps just one person feel like a tiny, insignificant speck lost in a cold, uncaring universe, then I'm doing my job. In other words, his science is not neutral. They admit that they are trying to make you feel that you're totally insignificant. So I might well ask the question, what is truth in a cold, uncaring universe where all I'm doing is just dancing to my DNA? What then is beauty, which most of us can appreciate? And what are we doing when we say we appreciate some beautiful sunset or some beautiful fall scene like I've shown there? The answer is that the atheist cannot even pose the question, let alone answer the question. Because atheism, by definition, has no meaning. Because there is no meaning in atheism, meaning has no meaning. So who am I? You can't even ask it, because blind, all you've got is blind, pitiless indifference. I'm going to close on one famous interaction, which is described in John chapter 18. One person stands on trial before another. Imagine the scene. In the judgment seat is Pontius Pilate. In front of him is Jesus Christ. Jesus Christ says something extraordinary. He says, quite calmly and collectedly, "He that is of the truth hears my voice." To which Pontius Pilate says, many people think that he's just being dismissive. No, he's not. Because of what happens later shows to us that he was really thinking. He says, what is truth? It's an incredible exchange. A bit earlier, or a very similar time, his wife comes in and says, "Have thou nothing to do with this just man? I've been dreaming about him." He goes to the crowd. He says, "This man's done nothing amiss." And then he says, "I'm going to wash my hands of this man." He takes water literally to try and get his conscience clear as to what he's about to be forced, he thinks, into doing. In other words, it was not, "Oh, what is truth?" No. It was nothing like a Dawkins retort. It was actually a deep question. Just what is truth? And if only Pilate had grasped that right in front of him was truth personified, as well as absolute. And this is what I want to bring to your attention as I close. I've been showing to you that truth is there, and it's actually Jesus himself. God has demonstrated truth in the person of Christ. So truth is absolute, it's not distant, it's near, and it's in the person of Christ. You see, Jesus Christ is described in the Bible as by him all things consist in Colossians chapter 1. In Hebrews chapter 1, verse 3, I know you're saying, well, I don't accept the Bible. Just hear what it says. It says in Hebrews 1, verse 3, he upholds all things by the word of his power. Now, if this book is true, and I grant you, because you're saying I haven't yet proved it, well, in one sense, I can't totally prove it in the way that you might like me to. But what you have to do is to actually read this book and consider for a moment the person of Christ, because you have a tremendous dilemma. You cannot say that this man is just a good teacher. You haven't got that option, because no good teacher would draw attention to himself egotistically and say, basically, which he actually said in John 14, I am the truth. He was effectively saying the same thing to Pilate. He that is of the truth, hears my voice. You haven't got that option. You've only got three options in establishing who Christ is, and that's what I challenge you to do as we close. Is he a liar? Which, frankly, the whole life of Christ shows to you that he can't be. Look at the things that he did, the speeches he gave. His teaching shows that he's not a liar. Okay? You say he's lost his marbles, he's a lunatic. You haven't got that option. Because no lunatic could ever speak like this man. Even the centurion said, no man has spoken like this man. And the centurion, another centurion at the cross said, truly, this is the Son of God. Even the thief on the cross said, this man's done nothing wrong. And Pilate is saying, this man is not guilty. But he feels he was forced into saying, go with the crowd. Tradition has it that Pilate didn't end life very well himself after all this. He never forgot it. So what is the third option? That Jesus Christ is who he said he was, the Son of God. I think the credentials are there. And if the Bible is right on all these issues, concerning the qualities we admire in Christ, personal truth, compassion, humility, I've been talking about the science, then, my dear friend, I would suggest to you that you need to come with humility and understand that Jesus was right when he talked about a judgment to come, when he talked about the necessity of believing in him as the one who would bleed and to die and be hung up, that he might take the weight of all our sins, of all those who believe in him, upon himself. Even if you don't yet agree with me, will you do one thing as I close? Promise yourself that you will read the whole of John's Gospel. It will simply take you about 2.5 to 3 hours at the most. You won't be able to put it down if you simply say, I want to find out who Christ is. Is John telling a pack of lies? It doesn't read like that. He's just simply telling what he saw. And he was actually at the cross when Jesus died. And 3 days later, he was one of the first to meet the risen Christ. Time won't permit me to go into the evidence for the resurrection, which is yet another evidence that Jesus Christ is the truth, and that he is the one who basically has made the whole of science, which I love to look at. I think the case is exceedingly strong, that science not only has not killed God, but that science, like a massive signpost, points all the atheists of this world to God himself, and that they are suppressing this wonderful truth in unrighteous words and deeds. May God be praised. Thank you. Sorry, we had a few technical difficulties. I'll try and resolve that. But we're going to start again very shortly. But we need to have a bit of a break, though. Is it 2:30 we start? Yeah.
So we'll just have a break and snacks out on the patio and just enjoy the fellowship, and we'll come back at 2:30 abouts. Thanks, Andy.
Writing's there, yeah. But we haven't really got this right at all.